a good audience, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.
Okay, rolling.
This is the birthplace of Elvis Presley, located in Tupelo, Mississippi. Elvis's father, Vernon Presley, built it with $180 which he borrowed during the Depression and was unable to repay. So the Presleys lost the house when Elvis was 3 years old. And this is Graceland, as it looked when Elvis first bought it in 1957. It is only about 100 miles from Elvis's birthplace, but there is really no way to measure the distance he traveled to get here from such humble beginnings. Graceland was still in the country on the outskirts of Memphis when Elvis bought it, and it offered the seclusion that he needed from his fans whose devotion could be overwhelming.
This is Graceland today. It isn't as quiet as it used to be. Old Highway 51 has become a congested 6-lane throughway called Elvis Presley Boulevard. Much of the traffic is headed here to Graceland, which has become a tourist attraction and a museum. For most, it is simply a curiosity, but for some, it is a shrine which is without equal in popular culture.
This guy is the only guy that I know of that has done more, really more for America than anything in America except the American flag. He's more recognized, and you can't fool even the people in the United States indefinitely.
The great thing about Elvis, which is some kind of like weird Zen riddle, Elvis would say the greatest thing and do the dumbest thing in the same 5 minutes in the movies or wherever on stage and not seem to know the difference. It just kind of was to Elvis. And it was just like, it's the American dream in its full glory, run amok.
Almost every time you would see him on a regular basis, he would have his guitar with him. So we would have parties at one house or another, and he would be there, and he would play his guitar. But before he would play, all the lights had to be out in the room. And he would sort of sit over in the corner, you know, by himself, get his head down, his guitar here. And everybody had to be involved with something else, you know, busy doing another activity. And it's as if we were not listening to him. And that made it all right.
It gives you all that strength. It gives you strength that you don't know where you got it from. You don't need to pop a pill. Just put on an Elvis record. My next door neighbor said, Betty Lou, you're going to put the psychiatrists out of business.
A fan is more or less like when Jesus came, you know? When Jesus was here, he had disciples. Different name, same meaning. Jesus came and he served the people. He took care of the homeless. He clothed them. The Elvis fans, they clothe and they feed. When Elvis was here, he clothed and he feed, or he fed.
Anyone who idolizes Elvis and considers him a church are sickies. They have the brains of gnats. Their brains are smaller than a mustard seed. And I understand that's quite small.
What was it about Elvis Presley? Why did he have such a huge impact on our music and our culture? What kind of man could capture the hearts and imaginations of so many people? And now, years after his death, why does Elvis's influence continue to be so great? If you think about James Dean or Marilyn Monroe or John Lennon, it isn't quite the same. Dean and Monroe may rival Elvis as pop icons, as images for t-shirts and posters and things like that, but there's something different about Elvis. Every time you turn on the TV or pick up a newspaper, you see references to Elvis, and most of them don't even have anything to do with the real person. At the same time, the devotion of Elvis's fans is so great that some observers are even likening it to the beginning of a new religion. It's difficult to imagine that when, say, Frank Sinatra or Wayne Newton die, that there will be a candlelight vigil at their grave sites every year like there is for Elvis. In this program, we'll look at Elvis, the man, as remembered by people who knew him. We'll also talk to some of his fans, and we'll hear from writers, scholars, and other observers as we ask the question, why Elvis?
Those of us who live here have been very surprised to watch Memphis become a big tourist destination in the years since Elvis died. But people are coming now from all over the world, not just to visit Elvis's hometown, but because they're searching for an idealized version of the American dream that Elvis came to symbolize in the 1950s. Rock and roll was born in Memphis in the 50s, and what we're seeing is very similar to what was experienced in New Orleans in the years after World War II, as tourists from the jazz generation started to search for their roots.
Much of Elvis's early success came from being in the right place at the right time. Memphis was a melting pot of musical styles when Elvis was getting his start. As the big city at the northern tip of the Mississippi Delta, Memphis was the first destination for countless blues musicians who emerged from the plantations and small farming communities of the Delta. Musicians from the Delta had a knack for playing the raw blues that was so natural they seemed to be born with it. Musicians like B.B. King, Howlin' Wolf, and many others were drawn to world-famous Beale Street, where W.C. Handy had first written the blues form to sheet music in 1909. Beale Street was the cultural capital of Memphis's large black community. It was here that musicians polished their raw country blues into more urban sounds, adding horns and new arrangements that were influenced by jazz and rhythm and blues and all of the music that mingled on Beale Street every night until dawn. The Presleys lived a short distance from Beale Street, and Elvis's early visits there left an impression on him. Guitarist Calvin Newborn remembers how surprised he was when Elvis would come to see him in a Beale Street nightclub.
He asked me, could he play my guitar? You know, I should have known then, because, the club full of black people, and here comes a young white boy, barefooted. You know what I mean? Want to play my guitar. But I let him play it. And when he gave it back to me, it didn't have a string on it. I don't know how he did it, how he tore all the strings out, but he did. So that should have told me something right there. The cat was determined.
Kids in Memphis in the 50s could also listen to all kinds of music on the radio that wasn't yet available in most other cities. There was WDIA, the first black radio station in the country, where B.B. King and Rufus Thomas were among the celebrated on-air personalities who were pioneering black radio while Elvis was a teenager. Louis Cantor, a former high school classmate of Elvis, worked behind the scenes as an engineer at WDIA, and he recalls talking with Elvis about listening to the station.
The feeling was among white teenagers at that time that all this other stuff was extremely boring. I mean, you turned on the radio and what you got was, how much is that doggy in the window? And you got Perry Como and stuff. And DIA was the only station in town that was playing anything for people that were reasonably hip. And of course, obviously, Elvis was reasonably hip. So people did listen to it. White teenagers listened to it and didn't admit it or wouldn't tell their parents they listened to it. So Elvis listened quite frequently. I was on a shift that worked mostly gospel. And I said, are you hearing me on those gospel shows? He said, oh man, I like, it's that gospel music that I like.
And then there was Dewey Phillips with his Red Hot and Blue radio program on Memphis's WHBQ.
Right now, it's old Phillips bringing Red Hot Blue coming through WHBQ in Hotel Tisca on the magazine floor. Maybelline floor. Oh, that's right, they changed the name. Maybelline floor right in good old Memphis, Tennessee.
Maybe the single most significant influence on Elvis in putting together his music was Dewey Phillips. And Elvis's having listened to Dewey Phillips most nights of his life from the time he was 14 when Dewey started broadcasting on WHBQ until the time Elvis started recording. Dewey was an enormous star here when Elvis was just a little unheard of kid.
The disc jockeys were their own program directors. You could play anything you wanted. In other words, the stations went out and got the records, but you had access to whatever you wanted to play. You didn't play off of a playlist.
What he played was Rosetta Tharpe, Louis Jordan, Nat Cole, probably Bob Wills, Jimmy Reed, gospel records, records by white artists, records by black artists. Whatever he wanted to hear is what he played. And so this great amalgam of strong individual American music was absorbed by Elvis lying there as a little boy in the housing project.
No one is more responsible for giving Elvis his start than Sam Phillips, owner of Sun Records in Memphis, and surprisingly no relation to Dewey Phillips, though they worked together at promoting many of the same artists. From within the tiny two-room building that was Sun Records, Sam Phillips almost single-handedly produced a musical revolution. With his instinctive abilities to recognize talent and foster it in the recording studio, Phillips helped give birth to the careers of many legendary blues, country, and rock and roll stars, including B.B. King, Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, Roy Orbison, Johnny Cash, Charlie Rich, and, of course, Elvis Presley. He says it all comes down to freedom, the freedom he gave his artists to express themselves. Other people in the record business would not have known what to do with an artist like Elvis, and it is very possible that without Sam Phillips, he would never have made his first record.
I had a feeling from the very beginning that he had unusual, real raw talent, and that's what I like. The rawer the better, if you had the basics. I felt that if there was anybody that could do an amalgamation of rhythm and blues, or race music as they called it back in the 50s and 40s, and country music, and come out with something that was, well, it wasn't even named at the time. It wasn't named at that time. Alan Freed named it later on, rock and roll.
Elvis had a unique style when he started performing, but not everyone understood it. He was even fired from one of his first jobs as a singer.
When I first met Elvis, I had a western swing band and was playing at a club called the Hi-Hat in Memphis. And I needed a pop singer, so I got asked around where I could find one, and we ran across Elvis. So Elvis came out, and he was doing an extraordinary good job. Well, these people that run the club were the club was called the Hi-Hat, and it was more of the elite of Memphis. And so Elvis dressed like Elvis, with the pink breeches and the rose all run down the back of his neck, so to speak, and the black stripe going down his leg. And he didn't change for anyone. So he sang good, done a good job, but he didn't look good. He didn't fit that Hi-Hat club. So it broke my heart. She called me and told me, said, either you and the band go or you're going to get rid of Elvis.
Any journalist who comes to Memphis looking for Elvis stories can get an enthusiastic tour from Jimmy Denson, a childhood neighbor and friend of Elvis, whose brother, Jesse Lee Denson, taught Elvis his first chords on the guitar.
This is the Lauderdale Courts. This is 185 Winchester, where Elvis lived in apartment 328, where that lady in the window is standing now. That was the kitchen window of Gladys Presley for 5 years. The middle window is the bathroom window, and the next window is Vernon and Gladys's bedroom. The back bedroom was Vernon and Gladys.
One of Elvis's little-known early influences came from the laundry room directly below his apartment, where young Johnny Burnett, who later became famous with hits like You're 16, You're Beautiful, and You're Mine, practiced with his brother, Dorsey Burnett, and with Jesse Lee Denson.
For 5 years, they practiced in the welding shop, which was the laundry room at that time. Jesse Lee showed him how he could echo his voice from the laundry room stairs that came down from Elvis's apartment. A little narrow stairway is where Elvis sat and practiced all the time he lived here.
Journalists have been wary of conveying most of Denson's other information because his point of view is so unique.
Elvis was 10 times introverted. He was the shyest child in the world I've ever known, and for 7 years he walked with his eyes on the ground. And the first time I laid eyes on him, he was holding his mama's hand, walking like this, sticking his feet in the ground. And he wouldn't raise his head up. Mrs. Presley was born with the OPCD syndrome. She had an obsessive, possessive, compulsive disorder that is caused by a chemical imbalance in her brain, which caused her to fear that some harm was going to happen to Elvis. And she walked him until he got out of high school when he was 18 and a half years old. And yes, harm did come to Elvis, because when he was 19 and a half, he became a drug addict. In July of 1954, here's the man who put him on drugs, Dewey Phillips. And my brother Jesse Lee caught Dewey slipping Elvis drugs in the alley bar right off of Main Street where he hung out. The drugs he took when Dewey Phillips gave them to him allowed him to raise his head up off of the sidewalk in the dirt. We would have never heard him on the second record if he hadn't taken drugs.
Whether Denson is right or wrong, the Elvis who others have also remembered as a shy child transformed into a bold and energetic performer, but it's hard to believe that drugs alone could have been responsible for the dynamic stage presence he displayed early in his career.
Elvis had an inkling because it was something magic going on. It was something that, a charisma that nobody had never seen. It was a split between something. And I don't completely go along with this stuff about split between rhythm and blues and all that, because it didn't make any difference. If Elvis sung Old Shep, which was an old Red Foley song, which is country as you can get, and they done the same identical thing.
They rushed the stage with their little brownie box cameras and snapping pictures and squealing and screaming and just, there wasn't no dancing. They just get out there and shout and holler and carry on until they just, the blood left their head, I guess, and they fell down on the floor, and they pick them up and towed them out of there. I never saw nothing like it in my life.
I remember this guy stepping out on stage in this pink suit, kind of long, slick black hair, and jumping all over the place and just playing rhythm guitar, and this guy slapping the bass. And I just said, yeah, I want to be like him.
Elvis's first drummer, DJ Fontana, and his first guitar player, Scotty Moore, both remember how unpredictable Elvis could be on stage.
Well, we actually never knew what he's going to do. There's no set pattern for what he's going to do. You couldn't figure out what from 1 minute to the next. That's why we had to watch him so close on stage. Had to watch his arms, had to watch his foot, his legs, his hands. We knew where he was. And if the crowd was overbearing where we couldn't hear, but every movement meant something. And we knew exactly where he was.
I did an interview with Look Magazine or something. It was a fairly notable reporter. I told him, I said, well, we was the only band that I ever knew of that was literally directed by an ass. I thought the guy was going to die. But it's the truth.
I tell people maybe that's why I got the job. I used to play like strip shows down in Louisiana, and I used to watch him bounce around the stage, and every time he'd throw a leg up, finger up, summer crash, noise, tom-toms, and he'd like for you to underscore his movements. So I try to catch everything he did. But it's more fun that way. It's more actually fun. I think the guys now, they don't have any fun. That's no fun. Anybody can get on stage and read the charts, and so what do you got, you know?
Remembering history can depend a lot on who you ask. For example, we have more than one explanation of why Elvis wiggled the way he did on stage. All are distinctly different, and yet there is truth in each.
When he did have to get up on stage, he was absolutely terrified out of his mind, and he would just tremble, just shake all over. And of course, later on, that was desirable because I think his manager began to see then that was getting a response from the audience. And so then he did begin to incorporate that as part of his act, but it was as natural as anything.
You see him as he was when he was an excited young man, wild type of action with this movement, uncontrollable almost, you know? Because what happened, he had been in what you call a Holy Roller Church. That's all he had seen.
How his shaking really started, he just, instead of like most singer guitar players, country especially, stand on stage, they would just stand there and pat your foot maybe, or didn't pat your foot, and he more or less would kind of stand on the balls of his feet, and the shaking his leg was actually his way of keeping time.
Or I guess some of them would say sexually orientated type of movements that he was doing and stuff. He wasn't doing nothing but just what people been doing down here in the South all along. In other words, a lot of them just walk kind of funny. And it might be sexually to some people, but that's the way they was. And Elvis found out that the more you gyrated around and all that kind of stuff, it just like pouring gasoline on a fire.
They used to call me Legs because when I played my guitar, I would put my guitar on the side and keep time with my leg. And sometimes I would put it between my legs like I was making love to the guitar. Then Elvis used to come to the Flamingo Room and watch me. And that particular night that he broke all of the strings off my guitar, I could see that he was imitating me playing the guitar. But he was actually wrecking my guitar.
What about cleaning it up or at least improving it morally and maybe taking the wiggle out of it?
Well, sir, you take the wiggle out of it, it's finished.
If timing is to be blamed, then Elvis was right on time for a sexual revolution. Hugh Hefner had just started Playboy magazine the year before Elvis first recorded, and Marilyn Monroe was liberating the libidos of the male population, but no one had quite done as much for the young females until Elvis, whose name rhymed with pelvis, presented a clear and present danger.
Elvis went on TV in 1956 and literally wiped out 2,000 years of Judeo-Christian uptightness about sex. The whole fig leaf thing was pretty much blown out the window by Elvis on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Elvis arrived just in time for early television, and his strong visual presence made him a natural for the new TV audience.
There's a line of poetry by Lawrence Robb, poet I know, and he talks about culture, and the poem has the line, "Ye shall know the prince by his looks." And when Elvis Presley came along, people knew what it was that Bill Haley was all about, what it was that Fats Domino, for that matter, was all about. People black and white, that it had something to do with the burst of a new musical feeling. But none of them were the prince. None of them were the king. And here is someone who looks like Apollo and acts like Dionysus. Those are two archetypal opposites right there. And by when the king appears, you should know what he looks like, too. Suddenly, people were aware that someone had come and gathered up all these forces, and he was the right being to do that. Could rock and roll, could the social changes of the 50s and 60s occurred with someone else? That's an interesting question, but no one else looked the part.
Elvis Presley was not photogenic. He looked much better in person, because I was expecting him to look like he did in Jailhouse Rock, which was great, right? But he looked better than that, a lot better than that. I'm like, what? This is a human being? Are you kidding me?
He started getting his hair cut about 12 years old. His mother used to bring him in the shop. He was crazy about his mother. She would hold him by the hand, and she would bring him in the shop. She had a real nice dreamy eyes, and that's where he got his dreamy eyes from his mama. During that time, he wore his hair long and styled. You know, he liked his hair styled kind of straight back and his long sideburns. And I started to cut his sideburns, but he told me I better not mess with his sideburns. So he kind of got a little peeved about that. After he got out the chair, he would groom his hair in the mirror, you know, comb it a long time, combing for about 45 minutes.
The thing about Elvis that appealed to me the most was he was just so cool. You know what I mean, cool? I remember back in the days when money wasn't important and power and prestige wasn't important. It was, were you cool? Elvis was definitely a role model for everybody. If you wanted to be cool, you paid attention to Elvis.
Somehow or another, he's like some preachers you've seen in time, and that might not be a good word to use now, but he had that real ability to communicate to you, whether he was talking to you, just standing there making a few motions, or whether he was singing his heart out.
You know, someone once said to Elvis, he said, "Elvis, you have such great charisma. It really comes through in person and from the stage and through your records. Your charisma is what really stands out the most." And Elvis responded to the man's compliment by saying, "I appreciate it, But you know what charisma really is? Charisma is the light of God coming through a man.
There was some kind of an impulse between this guy and his audience that went beyond the enthusiastic response that so many artists get from their audience.
I just felt like that he was singing right to me. That was the impression that he gave me. And he just seemed to be begging somebody to love him.
People not only enjoyed his work as an artist, but they believed in him as an individual. And also, I think to know that he basically did not change a lot so far as his relations with people. Just the ordinary person on the street was something absolutely imperative to his unbelievable success.
The final significant thing about Elvis is his talent and the things he did with it. And no matter what else he did or did not do, he created some of the most interesting, heartfelt music of this century.
Presley, in my opinion, was a person probably with as much talent vocally that could be used with so many different types of songs as I've ever heard of in my life. He didn't follow any one path. He didn't just sing rock and roll and for that rhythm and blues, country. He sang pop. And when you can do that and give it an unbelievable, creditable interpretation, there's something to be said for it. Very few of us could do it.
He could do a song Ray Charles had done, or a song Little Richard had done, and put something on it that was unique so that you didn't think about where you first heard it. You know, it wasn't a matter of taking a piece of material and bleaching it white and removing all nutrition the way Pat Boone did. He took a song like I Got a Woman, speeded it up, and beat it to death. Made it really more interesting than the Ray Charles version, you know? It's musical genius that makes Elvis worth remembering.
Elvis evolved through many phases of his career. Each period added new dimensions to his appeal as a performer and heightened his position as a celebrity without equal.
Elvis goes into the Army, but not as an entertainer. He goes in as a regular Joe. Well, all of a sudden, he's not this softy that, you know, he's a real guy, and all of a sudden, he's acceptable to all the parents. He's already locked the kids in, and they're in, looks like, for the long haul. And he's not a rebellion. He's now a good American.
Now, this is what I used to carry in my purse at all times. And when I'd open them up, everybody enjoyed looking at them.
88-year-old Naomi Stiers is the world's oldest Elvis fan club president. She explains how Elvis's fans were determined not to forget about him while he was away in the Army.
We knew every disc jockey by his first name, and we made sure that all of our members of our clubs called in and requested songs and wrote in and requested them and bought his records. And every time a new record would come out, we would go to the stores and buy every record that they had. And if they didn't have any, we'd order 25 apiece. One week we'd be buying records. Maybe the next week we'd go to every jukebox available and put a dime in for every record that was on that. We didn't stop to listen to them. We went on to the next jukebox and put a bunch of dimes in it. We spent $5 apiece near about every other week playing records.
Elvis, do you think the music has changed since you've been out of the service? I mean, since you've been in the service?
Possibly, yes. I can't say, really. I haven't been here long enough to even know.
No.
Excuse me. The only thing I can say is that if it has changed, well, I would be foolish not to try to change with it, you know. But as of now, I have no reason to change anything.
As to your acting, you have stated you would like to be a more serious actor. And do you plan to possibly go to some school or some dramatic school?
It wouldn't hurt me any to go to school, but I learn best by experience. I never was very good in schools of any kind. And it's going to take me a long time and a lot of experience.
But that is your ultimate ambition?
But at the present time, it really is.
And he comes out of the Army, and the 4 best movies he made were the ones before he went in. And he comes out of the Army, and his mother's passed on, and all of a sudden, the Colonel's got him doing cheesier, very G-rated middle America movies. And he just made that step by taking those 2 years in the Army, not performing, and just leaking out tapes they had done, and it was just a brilliant maneuver.
Before Colonel Tom Parker became Elvis's manager, he had managed the careers of country stars like Eddie Arnold and Hank Snow. Recognizing a huge opportunity with Elvis, Parker convinced the Presley family to allow him to manage Elvis in return for an almost unheard-of 50% cut of his earnings. He still receives a lot of the credit and the blame for Elvis's successes and failures.
And whether the Colonel was brilliant or lucky, he seemed to have the right timing, and as sleazy as the Colonel was, and how, as far as creating good quality art in the way of music or films, he didn't care the least bit about. And from that point of view, from an Elvis fan, he made a whole lot of bad decisions. But from a strictly business point of view, he seemed to be brilliant.
I think the tragedy of Elvis was that he, in fact, was a great talent. I think he had an innate gift as a musician and a dancer. And were he to have fallen into the hands of producers and people like, say, the Beatles and Michael Jackson worked with, we can only imagine what his music might have evolved into. But he was really made into a carnival and treated like a freak and sold into pictures basically for top dollar rather than for what they could do to his ability and his skill as a performer. And I think it, in some ways, may have broken his heart.
And every one of his movies made money, and so I guess the producers and all felt, well, why change, because they're all successful movies. And back then, when Elvis was the very first actor to ever receive $1 million guaranteed up front, plus 50% of all box office. So with him receiving that kind of money, and with 50% of the box office, it was also a stipulation in the contract that he had no say-so over the script. But I know he did always want to do more serious movies. As a matter of fact, that's why he quit making movies and wanted to get back in live performances in front of the audiences, because that was his true love. His fans performing live was his true love.
And he's doing the comeback, and this was, the Colonel would have screwed up the comeback really bad. They had a big fight, and the producer and Elvis, the only time probably the Colonel was ever told no, and he did a real rockin' comeback special. Boom, all of a sudden he's back, no longer this cheesy movie star, he's really rockin'.
During Elvis's career as an actor, he had disappeared from the concert stage for a decade, and his records were mostly made to support his long string of movies. In January of 1969, barely a month after his successful TV comeback special, he went in the studio for a monumental 3-week recording session that produced classics such as Suspicious Minds and In the Ghetto. Peter Goralnik remembers writing a review for the record in Rolling Stone magazine.
What thrilled me about writing the review, aside from just his great album, was to be able to talk about Elvis in serious terms for an audience that was interested in music, because it had been so long. I always felt like I was just off in the wilderness somewhere. I know there were other people, but you didn't run into them very often. And when you mentioned Elvis Presley, it was almost as if, you like Elvis Presley. It's just, it was like a joke. And here was a record which was so strong and so real that it brought him right back into the fore. but in a different way. And I just felt like, from my point of view, it was one of the most amazing rediscoveries by an artist of his talent.
Elvis returned to the concert stage with a renewed dedication in the 1970s. Backed by a full orchestra with an elaborate stage show, the King of Rock and Roll had returned in all his glory and began to achieve the mythical proportions of a superhero as a new Elvis persona emerged. Now dressed in capes and sequin jumpsuits and singing an expanded repertoire that even included patriotic anthems, Elvis toured almost constantly for the rest of his life.
Elvis's favorite thing, if you had to narrow it down to one thing in the world of show business, was performing in front of a live audience. Elvis lived for a live audience. He just loved every minute on that stage. And the funny part about Elvis was, the older he got as a singer, the better he got. And part of that was that he studied his craft. He sang every day. He worked at it. It wasn't something, he was given that God-given voice, yes, but every day at Graceland, I don't think a day went by that he didn't sing for at least 30 minutes or an hour. He worked at it like an opera singer would.
And then he becomes this Vegas weirdness that somehow, you know, it was the part that I think needed to happen to solidify the myth, because now all you have to do is put a guy in a jumpsuit and he's an Elvis impersonator. Without that jumpsuit phase, I'm not sure we'd have the visible icon of Elvis. I'm not sure, you know, that the hair and the sideburns alone, you know, the myth needed the jumpsuit. And what would have happened if he had stayed alive? And would the myth still have grown?
As time passes by, it becomes more and more difficult to separate the truth about Elvis from the rumors and the legends, both positive and negative. We interviewed many people who actually knew him, and it's interesting to note that everyone had mostly kind things to say. One thing that we'd like to show you are some stories of his legendary generosity, which must be one of the reasons why Elvis continues to be so popular, not just as a performer, but as a person.
Elvis gave away a lot of money people don't know about. He would pick up the paper and read maybe where somebody had, their house had burned, or they had a sick child that needed money. There was money Elvis sent that was anonymous that nobody knew about.
You know, it was almost like he said, was saying, I've got to make this so I can give it to somebody that needs it more than I do.
And, you know, he would get mad if you didn't take it, though. It would hurt his feelings. And he wanted to make you happy. If he made you happy, it made him happy. And that was one of his ways of existence. He had all this money and everything, nothing to do with it except spend it. He said, I can't take it with me.
It was a private thing with him. He only gave to his friends. In other words, he didn't have an audience. He would call a person in and just give him the keys to a new car. No fanfare, no nothing, and tell him the car was out in the driveway. He didn't have an audience. He would talk to the person or the person's wife. He was kind of sharp like that.
He was going to the Pontiac place one day, and just as he got to the door, a little black girl, a young black girl, was coming out of the door of the Pontiac place, and she was crying. And he grabbed her arm and he said, "Hey, honey, what's wrong with you?" And she said, "Well, I want a car and they won't sell it to me." And he said, "Why not?" He said, "What do you want a car for?" And she said, "Well, she had to have a car to go to school, and she needed a car to get to work, and she was looking for a job." So he took her back in the Pontiac place and asked which car she had wanted, and he bought her the car. And he said, "Now you be at Graceland at 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. You have a job there." So Maggie's job was to go to Graceland every day at 4 o'clock and sit at the kitchen table and do her homework. She was enrolled at Memphis State to do her homework, answer the telephone, and then Maggie brought his tray to him at night. And he wanted to see her grades every quarter. He paid for her schooling, he paid for her car, he paid for her everything, you know. He paid her a salary to sit there and answer the telephone so she would have a job that she could go and study.
Another thing which contributes to the growing legend surrounding Elvis is the sad way in which his life ended. I talked to more than one fan from the legions who gather in Memphis every year who said they never came to Graceland until after Elvis died. There's something about the shared experience of mourning that holds an attraction for many people, and it is rooted in a genuine tragedy.
I really think of him as a very nice person. And the Elvis that came on later, it's really almost incompatible with the way he began. You just don't think of it as the same person.
Everybody tries to take the last 2 years of his life, and they try to make a big deal over all this, that he took too many prescription medicines. They like to say drugs, but it was prescription medicine, which a lot of people have taken. They have overtaken those. But they don't take all the years of his life.
I don't think Elvis's health started really deteriorating until around 73, maybe 74. You know, Elvis, what people don't realize was that Elvis was a very sick man. He had a lot of things physically wrong with him that he was seeing doctors for, and he was having to take so many different kind of prescribed medications now for these different things that were wrong with him.
Number one, we don't know why he was taking too much. Maybe he had a lot of pain that nobody knows about. And then two, you don't tell anybody. I'm sure people tried to help him, but you don't tell anybody. You know, people have got to help themselves. You can't. I think people around him really cared about him, and I think who can say he handled it? I don't know of a lot of people that probably, could have handled it any better.
Regardless of who was in his life, no one was able to get him to stop doing some of the things that he was doing that were destructive to him. It was almost like he was on a self-destructive trip that it became unbearable to handle the fame, the appetite for strokes that he had. And one questions how much of these strokes, how much of the attention he got, he could actually absorb. Because usually we find when people have severe weight problems, they usually have difficulty in taking in strokes. And eating is a sort of stroking yourself. And developing the body armor or the fat is a way of warding off some real connection to people. At the same time, here he is on the stage, connecting with people, projecting his message very clearly. So he's a very complicated individual, and to attempt to diagnose him or put labels on him certainly would not be fair.
But I asked him, I said, well, do you ever get tired of this life, He said, yeah. Sometimes, he said, if I knew that my bills would be paid for, and I didn't know anybody, I'd give it all up so I could go fishing with you, with my friends. I could go out and play ball and not be mobbed. I could go out in the daytime instead of night. I could be a day person. I could, I could do things like a normal person. He said, sometimes I get so sick of this. He said, yeah, I realize I can't live like you do. I have to live at night. He said, it's my lifestyle. He said, I'm a star, and that's what I'm supposed to do. And I can't be normal.
When Elvis died, he left 4 bank accounts. 3 were savings accounts with very low balances, and the other was a non-interest-bearing checking account with a little over $1 million in it. He didn't care as much about piling up money or saving it as he enjoyed spending it and giving it away, and he'd always been able to go out and make more if he wanted to. He had very few investments, and his estate was estimated to be worth about $5 million, which isn't a lot considering that he'd made at least that much every year for many years. But now the Presley estate grosses close to $50 million every year, and his daughter Lisa Marie's net worth may exceed $100 million by the time she gains control at the age of 30. But the managers of the Presley estate are riding a wave that they did not create. Elvis's continued popularity transcends promotional hype and has a life of its own. The growing interest is reflected in the rising price of Elvis collectibles. Any Elvis signature is said to bring at least $800, and one of his guitars sold recently for over $250,000. But it isn't just about money. I know someone who has some of Elvis's underwear. I heard of a comedian who has his toe tag from the morgue. This isn't anything new. It's just surprising that this kind of interest is still so great so many years after Elvis died.
And we would send a specimen to the lab and it would never get there. because it had his name on it. And they, you know, even turning his name around and putting him in under an assumed name, people knew it. And they just wanted anything that they could get. I know when he went home one time, I took all the foil off the windows and rolled it up and threw it down the incinerator. And a couple of the employees came up and said, "Why didn't you give us that foil?" And I said, "What do you want with a bunch of old used foil for?" And they said, "Well, that was in Elvis's room." And I said, "Well, golly, it was just foil, you know," but it meant a lot to them.
He is still alive. He's alive in our hearts. He always will be.
Surveys continue to show that a small percentage of Americans believe that Elvis is still alive. The weekly tabloids tell readers this and many other wild and illogical things. Some people might believe what they read in the tabloid press, but, you know, some people still think the world is flat, and some people don't know when to get off the bus unless the bus driver tells them to. I have talked to many devoted Elvis fans, and I have not met one who really believes Elvis is still alive. In fact, when Elvis's cook, Mary Jenkins, spoke to Elvis fans at an Elvis Week symposium, she pleaded that the media should stop talking about him being alive, and the fans cheered.
Now, I wish that was true. I don't think anybody wish he was alive. I wish he was. But he's not. He's dead, and they should let him rest. That's right.
Of course, we will probably continue to hear about the sightings of Elvis lookalikes, but this is mostly due to Elvis's unique style and his lasting impact on the fashion world.
Elvis was, to my knowledge, the first masculine celebrity entertainer figure who possessed a physical quality hitherto associated with women. I mean, he was like a hoochie-coochie dancer, you know. I mean, people like Clark Gable and Gary Cooper, very attractive, you know, great masculinity. Elvis didn't have exactly masculinity. He had physical appeal. I mean, in a way that was traditionally associated with women. What I'm saying is that I think it's unlikely that we would have had a Mick Jagger or a Prince or maybe a David Bowie or a Boy George in quite the same way without the precedent of Elvis.
I feel that Elvis, his success actually broke the ice for civil rights, because that was the issue during that time. And the fact that he sent the black idiom all over the world in his music.
For me, Elvis is symbol of freedom. And you know, for young people in former Soviet Union, Elvis is symbol of freedom, of course.
Dr. Tata Yuritskaya is from Boris Yeltsin's hometown of Sverdlovsk, and she says Yeltsin helped her start the Soviet Union's first private medical practice there.
And I know that Boris Yeltsin always loved Elvis because we talk about Elvis.
This leads us to a story that may seem unbelievable. On the historic day in 1991, after Boris Yeltsin made his defiant speech against the attempted military coup in Russia, he then went inside and called Prime Minister John Major in England and said something like, "I have made my stand, but I don't know how long it will last." Yeltsin then locked himself in a room and listened to Elvis Presley's record, "Are You Lonesome Tonight?"
How about Elvis fans for Clinton Gore?
It seems just about as unbelievable that Elvis became a vague symbolic issue to be tossed around by both major American presidential candidates in the 1992 election.
Mr. Bush, at his great speech at the Republican convention, said that my economic program reminded him of Elvis economics. Well, the difference in Elvis and Bush's plan for the economy is that Elvis has been cited in several places in America.
My whole fascination with Elvis, when I wrote Elvis is Everywhere, literally I was, I mean, not to be metaphysical about it, but I was just a conduit for a bunch of Elvis vibrations that were happening at the time. In the song, Elvis is Everywhere, I was doing this Chuck Berry song, Tulane, and at the end of the song I'd go, and one night I was doing that and I literally said everything that ever in the song. I said half the song on stage, it just poured out of me, just boom.
When I look out into your eyes out there, when I look out into your faces, you know what I see? I see a little bit of Elvis in each and every one of you out there. Let me tell you, well, Elvis is everywhere. Elvis is everything. Elvis is everybody. Elvis is still the king. Man, oh man, what I want you to see is that the big E's like you and me. Elvis is everywhere, man. He's in everything. He's in everybody. Elvis is in your jeans.
Elvis started showing up in my pictures in 1989. I was doing some photographs of other things, and in the background I noticed there was a Elvis t-shirt, an Elvis logo. I'm shooting a picture on the street, a bus goes by and it says Elvis on it. And the whole roll practically had something to do with Elvis in the background, and that became a source of fascination. So I took a couple of weeks off and started photographing and changing the focus rather than looking, at the stuff in the foreground. I started looking for the Elvis images in the background, and I found them everywhere.
It's really Elvis-lution. Elvis-lution. Elvis is everywhere. Elvis is everything. Elvis is everybody. Elvis is still the king. Man, oh man, what I want you to see is that the big E's like you and me. Elvis is everywhere. Elvis is everything. Elvis is everybody. Elvis is still the king. Man, oh man, what I want you to see is that the big E's inside of you and me. Elvis.
Like it, man. Mojo's song Elvis is Everywhere, people who are Elvis fans think it's an Elvis tribute song, and people who think Elvis was a joke by the end of his life think it's a song poking fun of Elvis. And it's, the whole phenomenon is that way. You can read whatever you want into Elvis.
Give me an E! Give me an L! L! B! Give me an I! I! An S! S! What does it spell? Elvis! I can't hear you. Elvis! Still can't hear you! Elvis! Yes!
If you're not an Elvis fan, you can't explain why. But if you are, you don't need to.
I've not taken a vacation anywhere but Memphis in 14 years. I mean, one of the reasons is the fact that I like to collect Elvis stuff. I go around the shops trying to find stuff I haven't got. I'm pleased to say it's getting a bit harder. I'm sort of getting on top of it. But you need to be a millionaire to really do it. I think if you were, it would spoil the fun, actually, we're all on a bit of a limited budget, so you have to pick and choose a bit more carefully.
Yes, we are working people, and we have to work hard. I work in England. I have a full-time job. I work 5 days a week, 6 days a week, 7 days a week, sometimes 12 hours a day, all to get the extra money to save to be able to come to Memphis every year.
I've got a lot of Elvis records. I've got over 3,000. I really have. Yeah. I'm a collector. And I got, I think when I get home, I'll now have 400 Elvis CDs. And coming up to 400 books. And I'm telling you the truth, I really have got that lot.
I have Elvis's room in my house. It is my favorite room, and I spend the best hours in this room with my friends.
Elvis people, 95% of them are just the greatest people on earth. There's 5% they usually show on TV.
The weird ones.
The other kind.
The clouds over Graceland, how they seem to bunch up a lot. Every year on August 17th, on Elvis Aaron Presley's death day, if there was a cloud that resembled Elvis. And if you can notice right now, that these clouds are bunched down over Graceland, and there's not a lot of clouds in the sky right now, if you can notice that.
Here we are in front of Elvis's home, Memphis, Tennessee, and inside this trash can we see a record album of Robert Goulet. Obviously some fan has burned the record album, something that Elvis may have done, that we all know that whenever Robert Goulet appeared on television, Elvis would shoot off the television screen. Coincidentally enough, here is poor Robert.
What really thrills me, when I come down here and see the younger generation, I get goosebumps And I say, oh, Elvis, you got to be looking at, you got to be proud of these kids. You know, I get goosebumps with the younger generation. That's what makes me the proudest as an Elvis fan. Not just of all the fans that come down, but the little guys.
The highlight of each year for the most devoted Elvis fans is Elvis Presley International Tribute Week during the middle of August on the anniversary of Elvis's death. It is like a convention for the 10 or 15,000 fans who fill the hotels in Memphis to capacity as they gather from around the world for a week of activities. They have swap meets and sock hops and rockabilly concerts. They have panel discussions where some of Elvis's friends speak and answer questions and sign autographs or have their pictures taken with the fans. They can tour Elvis's high school and other sites, and they hold fundraising events in Elvis's honor, like this race in front of Graceland, and this charity banquet sponsored by Elvis's former nurse, Marion Koch. There is an Elvis art contest, and one hotel encourages fans to pay tribute to Elvis through this window decorating contest. The activities of Elvis Week are centered around Graceland, and the existence of such a shrine is essential to the magnetic attraction that Elvis continues to have throughout the year. You can't tour the homes of people like Buddy Holly or James Dean, but Graceland, which is toured by over 600,000 people a year, helps generate ongoing interest in Elvis. Some fans visit Graceland every day while they're in Memphis. For a couple of hours early each morning, they are allowed to walk up and visit the meditation gardens where Elvis, his mother, father, and grandmother are buried. These morning gatherings are small and quiet, and unlike the paid tours through the house later in the day, this time is free to the public. But the main event of Elvis Week is the annual candlelight vigil on the eve of the anniversary of Elvis's death.
Once again, we are privileged to come together and pay tribute to Elvis Presley, a beautiful and loving human being.
It just gets bigger every year, doesn't it? Everybody keeps saying one of these days it's going to die out. One of these days they won't come. It'll never happen.
We light this candle for the people that could not be here with us tonight. The light from this candle joins hearts around the world.
We stand here tonight with Elvis in our hearts and thoughts, so is a dear friend in our hearts and thoughts. Not only do we feel that we've known Elvis forever, we also feel we've known each other forever. The vine of life has intertwined our lives with Elvis's and each other.
Your eyes allowed me to see the kindness, the joy, the sadness, and the love within the man. I can still vividly see the curl of your lip and the pout of your mouth, my love. Elvis, we are filled with the love you gave, which is moving through each of us tonight just as strongly as it did the first time ever we saw your face. As the flame of our candles dance, let it be symbolic of the light that Elvis has left dancing in our hearts.
The vigil has grown to astounding proportions and could now be described as some kind of cultural three-ring circus. In the center ring are the true fans who stand in line for many hours so that they might pass through the gates of Graceland with their candles as they make the solemn and slow walk by the grave sites. In another ring are the curiosity seekers and the media who are there in great numbers, as if almost half the crowd is there to observe and document the other half. Journalists and others descend upon the crowd of fans with scores of cameras, making some fans feel like celebrities and some like freaks. There is also a third contingent, the blatant non-believers. These are mostly young locals who bring beer and stand in groups away from the main crowd as they make fun of the fans and even taunt them with cynical and bigoted remarks. This interaction seems to echo a sense of persecution which has, no doubt, been experienced by other believers throughout history. Some of the old-timers among the fans say they long vigils of the first few years after Elvis died. It seems that much of the purity and spontaneity has been lost since the first vigil, when only 300 or 400 fans stayed on the lawn of Graceland all night together. Perhaps the event was so genuinely unique that the media and the rest of the world soon wanted to know what it was about, and it has snowballed so that now some 10,000 to 15,000 people are herded through Graceland in a long procession at the vigil, and it shows little sign of dying out anytime soon.
Oh, it just made me feel warm on the inside. I just felt close to God, close to Elvis. I think I couldn't believe the presence of all the spirit there, you know.
Well, this year, I don't know why, but it was a lot more emotional for me. I can't hardly talk about it.
Yeah. Well, there's something about Elvis each time that you hear music, or when you saw him sing, you felt like that he was doing it just right to you. And it's amazing how emotional some of the men are. Of course, we fight it back, you know, because we're tough. But the women, they feel more deeply. And they actually, I mean, it's just like a brother. And when they think, it's the same thing as if they had a brother died 14 years ago, and they recall the memories and how tremendous the brother was, how much they miss him, then they get teary-eyed. And the men, the ones that feel that way, try not to show it. But there's a lot of us that feel that way, because he was just a tremendous human being, the best entertainer and the most charitable entertainer that ever lived.
Hello, welcome to Holly Springs in the historical town, and welcome to a tour of Graceland 2. My name is Paul McLeod. I consider myself, being my son, of being the world's #1 Elvis fan, and I'd like to take this time to introduce you to my son, Elvis Aaron Presley McLeod.
Graceland, too, is an extraordinary museum and shrine located halfway between Memphis and Elvis's birthplace of Tupelo, Mississippi.
What we're doing here, the red staircase, is we're devoted it to Elvis. It's like a stairway to Elvis, with the license plates and whiskey decanters and the original boxes that came with everything, and the cardboard cut of Elvis up there at the head. And other little details that we keep around the stairway are pieces of like Elvis's carpet that came from his home, along with the teddy bears.
Paul and Elvis McLeod live in Graceland, too, but it is difficult to see where they sleep because the place is bursting at the seams with their Elvis collection. More than a museum of memorabilia, it is the world's largest archive of Elvis information. The fact is, the McLeods don't sleep very much because they have assigned themselves the responsibility of monitoring all media for mentions of Elvis 24 hours a day. They have a TV room, a radio room, and a newspaper room, and they tape every TV or radio program which even mentions Elvis, and they collect and catalog every book, magazine, or newspaper they can get their hands on.
The books that you see, the plastic binders that you see in the racks here, represent a certain individual tape. For example, this book represents 135 VHS. And on 135 VHS in chronological order contains a daily outline or a diary log of information said on TV for each item that's on this tape in chronological order. For example, this program, 60 Minutes on Channel 3, the date, the time, the channel, what time Elvis was mentioned.
How the McLeods actually survive is a mystery. Although they have an unlisted telephone number, researchers and journalists still call them and ask for Elvis information, but no one pays them for their research services. Running Graceland 2 is a full-time job, and they have no other jobs. All their archival work is done by hand. When we visited them, they didn't have a computer or even a typewriter. They had not owned a car in 5 years, and they did not have a checking account. They ask for a $3 donation for the tour, but they donate the money to the Elvis Presley Memorial Trauma Center in Memphis. And they'll show you receipts from the Trauma Center to make sure you believe they aren't going to keep the money.
We have a copy of Elvis's gold suit that he had back in 1957.
that this is just a copy of it. Matter of fact, it's also my burial suit. Someday I plan to be buried in a suit like this for me and my son as the world's #1 Elvis fan.
This kind of devotion may be impossible to explain, but a visit to Graceland 2 is definitely worth the trip.
200 years from now, he's going to be a lot like Johnny Appleseed, Uncle Sam. Both were real people at one point, and they had a basis in reality, and now they're just myths.
It's pretty hard to pervert what Elvis's message was because it's all on record for the most part. It's records in movies. So now it seems like the messenger himself is being perverted. Dee accusing him of sleeping with his mother and being bisexual. So the messenger, instead of his message, is being perverted.
Everybody who ever knew Elvis, will be dead, in some time, and then it'll just be all second and third and fourth-hand information. And even people that probably had Elvis in their lives, and they begin to believe the myth too, or they have their own Elvis myth.
There was as many as 12 of us, and Elvis would be 13. And from the very beginning, most of the time, it was 13 of us, including Elvis. And it's like Jesus and his disciples,
He knew he was a myth. I think that's one of the things that caused his life to have both grandeur and pain, is that he was aware that he was an archetypal personage. He also was aware he was common Mississippi clay. And trying to keep both those things in balance to each other was part of the struggle he went through every day, which is why he needed people like his mother or Colonel Parker or the adulation of fans. And in the final years, of course, the drugs. All those things had to do with that disproportion of the two beings.
I think what we're witnessing now, on past, going on 10 to 20 years after Elvis's death, is very similar to the creation of a new religion, in socio-psychological terms.
And we don't come to worship Elvis.
Right. As Elvis told everybody, if they call him the king, he says, no, there's only one king, it's Jesus Christ.
Now, you might have some people that are worshiping him that have a lack of understanding, all right? Those of us who have understanding knows that God is God all by himself, and that Elvis was only the instrument.
In England, the Elvis fan club have lots of conventions and discos and things, and they do these for all different charities in England. We had a benefit for a little girl by the name of Cashin Pope that needed liver transplant. St. Jude's, La Bonheur, or even an Elvis fan that had all their collection burned, their home burned. There was a young lady over here that got stranded from overseas, and we took up money for her at everything we did. It's just basically things that Elvis would do.
Because each year Elvis donated $50,000 to 10 different charities every Christmas. And he wouldn't deduct it from his income tax because he didn't think that would be giving it in the right spirit.
I know that the average fan would probably deny that this is a religion in the making because they're not philosophizing. They're not looking at it in that on that level. They're looking at it as a person that they loved and that gave them back love. But that's what the mystics did. That's what the mystics preached. That's what Jesus preached. That's what Buddha preached. Well, I'll say all the mystics preached that sort of thing. And if the planet is around 100 years from now, I think there's very little doubt that there will be the religion of the Elvoids, the Elvites, what have you. And the Bible is being written now. Several, at least 6 of the books have been written. The Book of Esther, the Book of the Cook, the Book of the Nurse, the Book of West, the Book of Lacquer.
So you have a story that comes down through time. And with Elvis, this is a story that's becoming more and more embroidered.
She needed a wheelchair. And then when Elvis found out about it, he didn't just call up a store and say, deliver a wheelchair at such and such address. That was not Elvis. Elvis went and purchased a wheelchair and took it to her home, picked that lady up, 70-some-year-old lady up in his arms, set her in the wheelchair. He kneeled down, and he put some money in her wrinkled up hand, and she thanked him. With tears coming down her eyes, she thanked him. With tears coming down his eyes, he said, thank you. And he looked up at the guys and he said, this is my reward.
People are obviously getting something from going to this person's home, hearing his music, seeing his possessions, seeing his grave, his last resting place. This has rewards. And this is the stuff of myths.
When I first got married, my husband was always going to bring us here on an anniversary. Instead, every year I had a baby. And then when it got to be 5 babies, I couldn't afford to come here. And so he said, well, on our 25th wedding anniversary, the youngest should be 18. Then it's our time. I will take you to Graceland to meet Elvis on our silver wedding anniversary. But Elvis died in 77. And then he'd say to me, do you still want to go? I said, yes, I still want to go. Just to hold on to those gates that I have seen in so many pictures, magazines. Yes, I want to go. But then I lost my husband in October, and in April he would have brought me down. But I still carried my dream. I still carried it through. I was a mess when I was down here. My cheeks were so raw from crying, because I standing at the candlelight service with one candle for Dave, my husband, and one candle for myself, and looking up at the stars in the sky, well, there's 3 kings up there now, Jesus Christ, and my husband, Dave, and Elvis. So there's 3 kings up there. But anyway, so I come down every year, because I met so much beautiful people that comfort me, like Sylvia, I got more comfort here, than I did back in my own home, than I did with my family. I get more comfort here. And it's so sad that we got to leave. We got 365 more days to see each other again, right? But it's so sad that we got to leave each other. And the only way we can keep in touch is through mail, through our letters and our cards. But you all see each other every year we see each other. Every year. We meet here every year. It's like a class reunion, So we can meet each other from all over the world. We have pen pals and we meet here.
Now this shows that most of us are made up of things that are rather ordinary and rather, in a way, common. Well, Elvis had all of those wonderful qualities of being just another human being, but he also had that great talent. He had that sensitivity. So that star, quote-unquote, quality that he has, it has permeated the world, and it's that type of thing that you really can't explain, but even if you could, I don't think that you really would want to.
I don't know what to say, but it's been a pleasure being in Memphis, and wherever you are, if you're an Elvis fan, if Elvis was here, I'm sure he'd say something like very much.
We'll have you do that again. Yeah, the big truck came just right on here.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
We got all this other noise here. Let's see. Yeah, go for it.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
You're a good audience, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much.